Bonsoir à tous. Merci de nous
Good
avoir.
evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us on time for this second debate evening of 2023. I am going to hand over to Charles Personnaz, the director of the Institut National du Patrimoine, the French National Heritage Institute. Over to him. Thank you very much, Emilie. Good evening and welcome to this next debate evening in partnership between ICOM and the French National Heritage Institute, INP. I have been working on this topic for several years now about acquisitions. Recently, I went to a museum scientific institute that was being created with a number of different foreign institutions represented with the subject of acquisitions put to the table. The acquisitions managers at the foreign institutions said, no, we don't want to acquire anymore. And the museum being created, one of their leaders said, but this is one of the purposes of a museum, to enrich its collections. And we could just need to make sure that the conditions of these acquisitions are well respected. We can see through this that it has become very delicate, this act of acquiring. And with ICOM France, we'd like to come back to this matter now. I would like to thank all of the speakers who have accepted taking part in our thoughts this evening. And as you will see, this will include practitioners in acquisition and also more theoretical reflection on this specific act of acquisition. At the French National Heritage Institute, we are also trying to make sure that curator students recognize their role within this complex process, knowing what the law is, what the different actors involved are, the different stakeholders. And with Gilles Pilot, we've organized a day of meetings in order to meet different stakeholders in the market, the art market. For the majority of students before joining INP had never entered a sales room or a gallery and never asked themselves this question on this specific act and the diligence that it requires, with a proof required before acquisition. These are matters of due diligence. And you'll see the report that has been led, and we will be using this in order to ensure continuous training for our students and for curators. How can we adopt a due diligence in all of our acquisitions? I would now like to hand over to our partner, Emilie Girard, President of ICOM France. Once again, thank you all for coming, and thank you for so many of you being here this evening and for responding favorably to our invitation. Thank you so much, Charles Personnaz, for this introduction. I would also like to thank all of your teams at the French National Heritage Institute, the INP, all of your teams who have been helping us to prepare this evening. And Olivia, director of the Department of Curators, will be concluding this evening with us as well. So we're in our second evening of debate, and it's very important to take part. You can find the publications online and also in paper format. The topic this evening goes back to the fundamental issue of conservation. Article 2 of the French Museums Act reminds the missions, the permanent missions of French museums are to conserve, restore, study, and enrich its collections. The new museums definition approved in Prague, August of last year, also reaffirms this fundamental mission to enrich collections. The more observant among you may have noticed that the term used has changed. This verb acquire which has been used in previous definitions, Juliette will be talking about this, has been replaced by the substantive collect. What does this mean? Is this a paradigm shift, testifying to a new relationship and a new position of the museum with regard to its collections? That's what we're going to be asking. Why have we removed this verb acquire? Because it's associated with purchase and does not reflect the different types of enrichment of our collections. Or perhaps professionals across the entire world are working on restitution is associated with too many different challenges. The notion of collection perhaps better expresses this reasoned choice to develop a meaningful collection of works with a relationship between what is collected and those collecting. The role of museums and its social roles within neighborhoods mean that we need to rethink acquisition. The top-down model is being challenged today. Civil society would like to be better involved in the life of its institutions, and reading collections requires us to rethink policies for acquisition. Increasing collections need to take this into account, and museum professionals need to provide answers with a new deontological and ethical approach, which we'll be talking about today, looking at provenance, art markets, relationships with collectors, the role of citizens within this process, prioritizing acquisition of collections, and many other issues. So, can we still acquire, and how? I would like to warmly thank the speakers for sharing their experience and their expertise on this essential topic for our museums. Thank you as well to Ariane James Sarrazin, who will be moderating this evening, and everybody contributing within the development of the program. I would like to finish by thanking the teams at ICOM France, Anne-Claude Maurice, our permanent delegate, and Valérie Goscaf, who is an intern with us for a few weeks. A big thank you to our translators as well. This session, is translated into the 3 different languages. And thank you also to the people taking notes this evening in order to publish our report shortly after the event. I'm going to hand over to Ariane without further ado, and I wish you all an excellent evening. Thank you very much, Emilie and Charles. Good evening, everybody. The collection policy pursued by a museum throughout its existence can be read as its identity card, insofar as it is the collections, in the vast majority of cases, that are, in a way, the natural portrait of a museum. A portrait which, like that of any living model, evolves, takes on infinite nuances as it is inflected by the acquisitions made by each generation of museum professionals. Because as we know, a museum that lives and breathes, arousing the unquenchable interest of the public, collectors, the art market, and patrons, is a museum that acquires, and by that very fact generates proposals for acquisitions. In this way, little by little, a virtuous circle is established, provided that we put our acquisition methods to the test, particularly in terms of society's expectations and our own ethics, in terms of our methods of acquisition. It is therefore in the form of a slightly provocative question, which we hope will provoke debate and discussion, that ICOM France and the French National Heritage Institute wanted to bring together 6 major players in the field of acquisition thinking and practice, and we thank them for agreeing to take part in this exercise. I'm now going to present them succinctly now in the order of their first. So first of all, Marcus Waltz, good evening. You are Professor of Historical Museology and theoretical museology at Leipzig University in Germany and a member of ICOM FOM for museology at ICOM. You have taken part in debate at ICOM for the new museum definition with a number of different works and articles. You have contributed to the new edition of the new dictionary of the museology published by ICOM and another entity. And you have given us your article focused on acquisitions. Juliette Raoul-Duval, good evening. After a rich career in a number of science and technological museums like Palais de la Découverte in France, you were General Secretary and National Curator of the Arts et Métiers and Assistant Director. You have presided over ICOM France from 2016 to 2022, and at the 26th General Meeting of ICOM in Prague, you were elected President of ICOM Europe for 3 years. Among other things, you're a member of the working group of ICOM Define, and you have contributed broadly to reflection around the new museum definition, which was adopted in Prague. Olivia Voisin, good evening. You're an art historian specialized in the 19th century and relations between arts with a focus on Romanticism and the Achille affair. You are a specialist in this domain. Since 2015, you have led the Orleans Museums, leading one of the acquisition policies that is the most dynamic in France. This is deployed through all resources that the curators have: public purchase, acceptance of legacies and gifts. And we have seen the Bacchus Enfant by a famous artist entering into the collections recently. Leen Beyers, good evening, a historian and anthropologist specialized in urban history, anthropology of memory, and the history of migration. You are a curator at the Stroom Museum, Mass, where you lead the Department of Research and Collections. You're leading a number of different projects linked to diversity, with the question of constitution of collections, including the participation of the citizens. You're a member of COMCOL, the International Committee for Collection at ICOM. Marie-Christine Labourdette, you're a senior civil servant who has worked as Director of Museums in France from 2008 to 2018 and as President of the Cité de l'Architecture et du Patrimoine between 2018 and 2021. Since then, you have been the head of the Etablissement public du château de Fontainebleau, and together with Christian Giacomoto and Arnaud Osserdechuk, she's responsible for the report entitled Improving the Security of Acquisitions by National Museums in France, which was submitted to the French Minister of Culture in November 2022. And finally, Alexandre Giquello, good evening. You are an auctioneer and chairman of Drouot patrimoine. As such, he is one of the key figures interviewed for the report entitled Improving the Security of Acquisitions by National Museums that Marie-Christine Labourdette wrote, that I've just mentioned. And recently you co-organized with the Institut National d'Histoire de l'Art and the Conseil des Ventes on 7th of November 2022, a rich morning of study on provenance research, a new requirement of the art market. After this presentation of our different speakers, allow me to say something for the many listeners who have joined us today, to tell you how we will be organizing this evening. We have decided to organize discussion between the speakers and our virtual room around 4 themes, each lasting 25 minutes. Why do we acquire? How do we acquire? With what precautions and diligence do we acquire? And with what skills and knowledge do we acquire? Each of these themes will be followed, will include talks by our 6 speakers and immediately followed by discussions with listeners and the virtual room in order to ensure the best possible interaction between us all. The evening will conclude, as Emilie Girard said, by a summary by Olivier Zeder, who is Director of Studies at the INP Department of Collections, and we thank them warmly. Before tackling each of these themes, we wanted to take a look at both the semantics and the history of the term acquisition itself, which is generally used in France, insofar as it underpins a very singular and unique approach, both in time and in space. As Emilie Girard reminded us, debates around the new definition of the term museum showed us very clearly at ICOM. To prepare this evening, I consulted the Dictionnaire culturel de la langue française, the cultural dictionary of the French language by Alain Rey. This is very rich. I was struck by the breadth of the lexical field relating to the act of acquiring in order to define it. To acquire, depending on the page of the dictionary, can mean the equivalent of buying or receiving, inheriting. It can be to gather, to collect, to sample. And then we move into a different connotation, which could be more problematic, about taking, conquering, capturing, or even stealing or despoiling, depending on the pages and the synonyms within this cultural dictionary. Acquiring is also about enriching, enjoying, possessing, collecting, or even hoarding. As you can see, there are many connotations from the most positive to the most problematic from an ethical point of view. So my first question will be addressed to Marcus Waltz, looking at this semantic and historical approach. So Marcus Waltz, what historical developments do you think they represent, these connotations represent in terms of our relationship with our heritage?
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. So I've prepared a little presentation. There it is on the screen. Thank you. So I'd like to just present a few reflections about acquisition and collection, starting with the history of words and leading to the history of the development of the ICOM definition of the term museum. Next slide, please. So the starting point for both terms in French and English is Latin. Both are prepositional verbs, ad praera and cum legere. So next slide, please. So praerere means to acquire or procure. The preposition ad emphasizes the direction or goal in the sense of towards something. Next slide, please. Legere means to gather together, to choose, and the preposition cum emphasizes the context in the sense of in collaboration or simultaneously. Next slide. Acquire and collect are two verbs for the same process, which they consider from two different angles. The emphasis on the direction of acquisition opens up a vocabulary that concerns both the giver and the receiver, with purchased, gift, bequest, loan, or usufruct. Next slide, please. The verb to collect is not concerned with the fact that things have to come from somewhere. It's more about developing the collection, enriching it with new items, interesting counterparts, or new variants of a particular thing. Acquiring and collecting are two of the main tasks of museum work, and they also play an important role in ICOM's definition of museums. Unfortunately, the history of this series of terms has not yet been studied, and so I'm going to start with the oldest formulation that I know myself, that of Alexander Held, the director of the Royal Bavarian Natural Science Cabinet in Munich, who wrote this series of terms in 1845. He said, experience and instruction in collecting, preparing, classifying, displaying, storing, and showing natural objects. If we replace the term prepare, which is typical for natural objects, by that of conservation or preservation, the similarity with the current ICOM definition of museums is really striking. For today's topic, Alexander Held provides the verb to collect, or collecting, as we see here. The series of ICOM museum definitions began with the year in which ICOM was founded in 1946, and there is a very interesting discrepancy. Instead of the verb to collect, the noun collection is used. Our second term today, acquire, replaced the term collection in 1974. And it was during this fundamental reformulation of the ICOM definition of museum that the rigorous listing of the 5 main tasks of museum work appeared for the first time. At the same time, the vague definition of the domain of objects, the term objects was changed to material evidence of man and his environment. So the occasion for our conversation today and this event today is that the term acquire has left the ICOM definition of museum in 2022. At this point, the modernization of the definition of a museum, surprisingly takes us back to the 19th century and to the verb to collect from Alexander Held. Looking for reasons for this change of term leads us first of all to the specific problem of finished collections. Isn't a collection a museum simply because you already own all of the works of the artist concerned? Does that not make a museum? Are historic monuments not museums with their original decor? Does an Egyptology museum lose its status as a museum simply because the Egyptian state no longer allows the export of antiquities? If, while the definition focuses on collections and not on the activity of collecting, this problem is solved. But clearly, no one was interested in this particular detail, as demonstrated by the switch to acquisition in 1974. Completed collections were once again excluded from the definition. So one advantage of the concept of acquisition appears in 2007, but only in the English text. Acquire in English can be understood in English not only in a material sense, but also figuratively, because in English you acquire a belief, a profession, or traditional medicine by learning and by practicing it. However, this advantage only appears in certain languages. Such as the English language, indeed. So the ICOM's latest definition of museum proves once again that it's not focused on solving all the solutions to the problem. With the word collect, completed collections remain excluded. With the word collecting, sorry. So we can write about language-related phenomena such as stories or jokes, and this textual documentation can be called a collection, but it has a completely different quality to the collection of material evidence. For dances or processions, other forms of recording lead to documentation that can be preserved, although this documentation does not guarantee the permanence and the continuity of the phenomenon. So to summarize, first of all, there is no fundamental semantic difference between acquiring things and collecting things. Our gaze merely shifts in the same process from I want to get a thing, and I want to get your thing, and it shifts to the thing and me, the thing and my collection. Second thing is that ICOM's definition of museum leaves unclear on how we can collect cultural phenomena, intangible cultural phenomena, how we can collect or acquire them. And thirdly, it's not stated whether completed collections can be considered as an option for museum work. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, Marcus Valls. So we're now going to hand over to Juliette Raoul-Duval so that Juliette can talk to us about this understanding of the historical and cultural dimension of the act of acquiring, which was at the heart of the debates on the new definition of museum within ICOM. So, Juliette, we'd like to know, why did the debates crystallize around this term and this term of acquisition, and how were they resolved through the adoption of the word collect and collecting? Thank you very much, and good evening, everybody. I'm delighted to see you, Marcus. Greetings, lovely to see you on this online format. Also, greeting to Emilie and Charles of Personnaz. Thank you for continuing the cycle. And Ariane, thank you for allowing me to say a word about the term acquire, or rather its disappearance in the definition of museum, which was updated last summer by ICOM. So a number of you followed the progress and debate. And it's hard to believe that the disappearance of one of its terms is due to chance or forgetfulness. Is it serious? Well, it's up to you this evening as we think about this together. But what I can do is share my perspective as an insider, because for the last 3 years, I've been a member of the international working group that produced the ICOM definition, along with my friend Lia Anabi, a French speaker from Tunisia, whom I greet. I think they're here this evening. So this is perhaps an insider perspective on what happened within this. Key is that, and I'm sorry to be a bit crude here, Ariane, but until we opened up this issue at ICOM France, the disappearance of the term acquire had slipped through like water off a duck's back. Perhaps we were focused on other terms. A lot of attention was paid to the words chosen, much less to those abandoned. Acquire, however, did not disappear by chance. It was not a deliberate act, however, and it certainly wasn't a provocative act. I don't think anyone in the group, working group, said we're going to remove acquire, as we heard, for example, with regard to delectation or other terms. Acquire has been erased through the conjunction of two effects. One being the methodological choice made to produce the definition, and the other being the potential for misinterpretation of the term itself. So perhaps we could go over to the next slide so that we could look at the 3 different definitions, the definition from 2007, and then the definition from 2019, which was not approved. And then the version in 2022 where we focus in on collecting instead of acquiring. So perhaps we'll go straight on to the next slide, and this is the kind of methodology that we've started to develop. It's kind of become a model for the organization. It consisted of a meticulous participatory process to get the members themselves to come up with every word that would be set in stone in the definition. This was a total full participatory process behind which the members of the working group actually took a back seat. And we can, it all came together in a vote of approval at the General Conference in Prague last August. So there were 4 consultations with open to 50,000 members of ICOM in 134 countries where the organization is based. And despite my expectations, it worked. I admit that I doubted it, but 97 national and international committees solicited thousands of members, and the vote was a resounding success with 92% of people in favor. In concrete terms, for today's term, this term acquire, 2 stages were pivotal. Consultations to identify the keywords and concepts that needed to form the definition of museum. So this came from the members themselves, and then the following consultation involved prioritizing and ranking the keywords according to a precise rule. I won't go into more detail about the process. You can find it on the ICOM website, but I'll give you the results for our purposes. In the June 2021 consultation, acquisition was cited fairly often by the 97 participating committees, and you can see that it's present in 18% of responses and ranks 7th out of the 20 terms ranked. In the following consultation, the November 2021 consultation, now we're talking about acquire, not acquisition, and acquire dropped to 5%, and it dropped to last place out of the 20 words in the weighted ranking. So according to the rules set by the process, no word below 30% of citations was kept, so acquisition or acquire were out. So that's the participatory process effect. It's a choice from the grassroots, with the working group refraining from putting forward its own preferences. Let me now turn to the interpretation or misinterpretation of the word acquire. The methodology allowed comments to be added. I'll mention 2 that are useful for our debate. First thing to say is that not all museums acquire. So acquire is not a term that defines museums if they don't acquire, if they don't all acquire. I'm not giving my opinion, but this is the opinion of the members. Secondly, as you know, acquire is also an economic and financial term, synonymous with buying and appropriating at the end of a transaction, and this is the case in all of our working languages. Of course, we don't use it in this way. You've all talked about donations or bequests, but the dual meaning has been detrimental, and there's been a lot of comment around this. In this respect, we can point out that the expression not for profit has been retained as a compulsory element to being a museum within the meaning of ICOM. This too has given rise to misunderstandings because some see it as a ban on economic approaches, including ticket sales, but obviously that's not the case. But sometimes it's other people's languages that can help us. In English, we say not for profit. Museums are not designed to make a profit, even if they are obviously legitimately or even obliged to seek their own resources. To return to the term acquire, comments have suggested alternatives, enriching the collections, but the argument is the same. It's the same kind of notion that we're introducing through this, where there's an economic, financial notion. Or we could say increase the collections. And in the end, it was that the word collect, and thanks for putting up the next slide, it was the verb or the word collect that was used to describe the natural mission of museums, which is to increase the number of works or objects in their care. Many of us, I'll say this, many of us were reassured, even delighted to the return of collecting to its rightful place in the definition, because some of us remember that it was relegated to second place in the definition of 2019 presented at Kyoto. So I think we need to see this very positively. There is a real sincere commitment of ICOM's museum professionals in all regions of the world to maintain a separation between the commercial and non-commercial sectors and to confirm the museum as a common good. I'd just like to finish with 3 slightly personal comments. The first is that, to our surprise, my surprise anyway, the prominent place given to collections in the definition is already attracting criticism, even though we ourselves were so happy to have expanded the definition. Of course, people say that there are museums without collections, and of course there are. The second is the question I wanted to share with you about the limits of participation as well as the successes thereof. The third, which is more looking to the future, is that we're in the process of translating this definition into as many languages as possible, 60 of which are spoken at ICOM. Perhaps there's a word in one of them that is perfectly suited to our definition of acquire. I'm convinced that multilingualism enriches our thinking. I'm really looking forward to tonight's debate, because I want to know whether you think it's important that the word acquire is one of the 47 words in the definition of museum. And do you have to acquire to be a museum? Does collect serve as a sufficiently adequate synonym? So I leave you to decide. If we want to advocate the reintroduction of this word, I commit to fitting it into the next ICOM definition, since it's updated periodically, of course.
I think that unfortunately Ariane's microphone was switched off. My apologies. Thank you very much to Juliette. Before we move on to discussions around the 4 different themes, I would like to ask any of our listeners to respond or react to the first 2 presentations by Juliette and Marcus. So the floor is yours. Over to the audience for any questions, if you have any. I can see someone raising their hand. Is that Olivia? Shedila. Yes, I can speak. Good evening. I am really delighted to be here this evening, and thank you to ICOM France for giving us all of these opportunities to discuss important debates. I would like to come back to this term, acquire. I think that it was a sticking point in this museum's definition, particularly with the acceptance of the word collect and removal of the word acquire. In my opinion, in a museum, there are a number of different modes of acquisition. Let me give you a few. The word acquire for me does not necessarily mean that there is a trade or a commercialization of this term. It's about becoming the owner of something. The museum becomes the owner of its collections. And in the different methods of acquisition, there's purchase, which we need. There are some collections that need to be purchased. And then collection, in my opinion, is a mode among a number of others, restitution, gifts. These are all different methods of acquisition, and collecting for me is just one aspect of a museum's acquisition. I hope that I haven't taken up too much time, but that was my idea. As we have seen, the word collection appears in a large percentage of proposals. And it's the word collect or collecting that appears. But I think that collecting is just one of the many means of acquisition that a museum can adopt. Juliette, I have seen that you wanted to respond to what Shadia just said. Yes, I wanted to respond, but otherwise, if you prefer, Ariane, we can hear the other questions first. There's Sabrina Coralie who would like to ask a question. So yes, let's hand over to her and then we can come back to you to hear your reaction.
C'est à vous, Sabrina.
Over to you, Sabrina. Thank you. Good evening. Thank you for these thoughts about the word acquisition. I wanted to say that I am currently studying and researching provenance. I'm contributing to the Nanterre degree in this field. We're thinking a lot about these matters, about different items entering into collections, acquiring, like we said, can have a number of different meanings. I just wanted to note that, like the person who just spoke, I believe that it is a shame that the term has disappeared from the definition. In particular, I think that museums need to integrate within this definition this notion of diligence with anything entering into the inventory of collections, anything that falls under the label of Musée de France, Museums of France. This is just a comment that I had about this. With the current context of different disputes, I think that if the term comes up again, it would be important. And I think that it is important to talk about the diligence with regard to acquisition. Thank you. I'm going to respond now, says Juliette. Yes, I totally agree with what Giquello said and what Sabrina has said. I tried to explain, but I didn't tell you my point of view. I didn't tell you how this term disappeared from the new museum's definition. I was just trying to explain that we built a definition on the basis of a participatory model, asking members, a few thousand, maybe even more, responded, saying what words they wanted to appear in the definition and which words they didn't want to appear. This definition has its qualities and its shortcomings, but in the two words that I presented, we found ourselves in a situation that we're surprised by now. Giquello and myself would not have promoted this, on the contrary. But the word acquire was replaced by the word collect. You can see this on the final slide if you want to show this again. And this shows the argument of the working group in their choice of collect rather than acquire. Obviously, we all know that this word acquire can have multiple meanings. Some that are more about possession, this act of purchasing, with a market perspective, but we know that this was not our meaning behind it. But what I wanted to point out is that we ended up with this after this participatory process, which was quite unique. This word collection is linked to analysis of the survey, an external analysis that went through all of the questionnaires. We had 4 consultations over a period of 2 years linked to the term acquisition. 60% of responses, it was higher in some areas of the world rather than others. But this is how one word entered and another left the language, the definition. I'm not giving you my opinion, and we can perhaps re-argument for the reintroduction of the word acquire in the future. I've raised my hand in order to speak, this time as a simple listener. I find the words collect identifies, like Juliette said, is a mode of acquisition. It's extremely paradoxal. And as an archivist in the past, I can tell you that in the archiving world, we don't talk about acquisitions, but about collecting, in order to signify that the archivist, even if they are making decisions in what they're collecting, are faced with a flow and a secretion of archives and documents and heritage objects that are imposed, which is different to museum curators, which need to make decisions and selections in order to create a collection. I find it very paradoxical in the adoption of this term collecting, which is identified within a heritage context very clearly: anthropology, cartology, intangible heritage, and archiving. This shows a desire, in my opinion, to replace this notion of collections that we lose with the word acquire, whilst focusing on this action that does not have a choice in archiving. It's a very paradoxical term. And in some ways, I do not find it fully satisfactory. I do not know if there are any other reactions in the chat, or you can raise your hand to ask a question. I'm going to read a number of different reactions. Manuela saying, I found it important to look at the removal of this term acquisition. Reflection was presented to ICOFOM in Prague in 2022 in English. Reflections for reframing the taboos of collections. And then Magali Dufaux, who says, unfortunately, we have to leave this conference, but in response to Juliette Raoul-Duval, we believe that acquisition is not a term that should be central to the definition of a museum. Today, research and the transmission of what is already in the collections is a sufficient program. Tonight's question should instead be, should we continue to acquire? And for this, we refer to Jean Germain's article, Faut-il brûler les musées? Should museums be burnt down? Or Françoise Vergès' recent book, who asks whether museums should be emptied. What about the ethical issues surrounding financial speculation in cultural assets? Those are 2 reactions. And I think the second is something that we will come back to throughout this evening, given the themes that we're going to be discussing. If there are no other questions, I propose that we move straight on to the first theme, which looks at the reasons for acquisition. Very often when we talk to each other, and I'm sure that you've all experienced this, when we talk to our public or elected representatives, when we work with local authorities, with the wealth of our collections, only a small part of which can be exhibited simultaneously in our rooms. And there's a recurring situation with the saturation of our storerooms. One question comes up regularly from the public and from some elected representatives. So why then, in this case, are you continuing to acquire? Olivia, Voisin, and Leen Beyers, how would you answer this question? What is the point of continuing to acquire? And we saw this with Magali Dufaux. Some are asking why we shouldn't burn museums down and cease to acquire. So I'm going to leave you to share your insight on the reasons and acquisition dynamics. Perhaps Olivia could start. I think we'll wait to burn museums down. I think museums are still very full enough to give happiness to the public for many centuries to come yet. I think we're continuing to write the history of museums. We're reminded regularly that a museum not acquiring is a museum that dies. We see this systematically. We see this every year, that museums disappear from the map when they stop acquiring because they lose their identity, they lose their public, they lose their support, they lose their friends, they lose their patrons. This is a process that requires the selection of objects, the integration of objects in museum inventories. The venal dimension of acquisition is often mentioned, even if we don't have much, the mercenary nature, even if we don't have much money. This is something that we can write collectively through a number of different ways, using budget, yes, but also through patrons, by founding operations. You talked about participatory patrons as well. And also the historical creation of museums was through acquisitions. We're continuing to write the history of the museum that's been done since the start. So the museum is in regions, for instance, and a number of others. Of the 1,200 plus museums in France at the moment, not all were from the state. For the Museum of Orleans in 1803, there was a call for gifts asking Orleans and collectioners to give their collections in order to create a museum. In 7 years, a number of gifts and monetary gifts, which then led to acquisitions with a budget in order to continue research around its collections. This was a virtuous circle that continued, meaning that museums are now continue to be written with this same history, and with the public collections should not just be the responsibility of curators. Acquisitions are possible by studying collections, by knowing them well, by knowing the different stakeholders, the different works, the history. Also, what's lacking as well. Acquisition policy is also about what we're lacking. When we open works of art, we can see what our predecessors have not been able to acquire, works that they wanted, but were unable to acquire for a number of different reasons. And this policy always needs to be built with this in-depth knowledge of the museum. The collections are the identity of a museum. Collection is dependent on museums are dependent on their collections in their very definition. We need to be transmitting this, sharing this with our public. We need to know the provenance, share the mode of acquisition. And we're able to tell this story at the Museum of Orleans, the history of art, but also provenance. We talk a lot about provenance at the moment. This is a very divisive term at the moment. Provenance itself is a reason for acquisition. So we're writing this story with the public, not just curators themselves, because we're sharing collections without a public lose their interest, and acquisitions are a way of renewing interest. You're talking about virtuous circles. This is because we're able to communicate, we're able to capture public's interest in the history of art. It's important to see that acquisitions can be a response to certain gaps in our collections, to look at the history of art as it really was compared to how we would like it to be. We have a participatory patron working with us at the moment, the Museum of Montpellier as well, the Maison de Victor Hugo have their artwork by Juliette Raoul-Duval, but she was very important in the 1980s. François Mercier knows this Orleans-based artist, and it's very important to be able to tell this story. Acquisition, in this case, was mercenary and required a number of different patrons in order to renew interest in part of our collection and return to a former policy that we had with Dox Marcel, the romantic part of our collection. I'm saying this because it's important when we're communicating about the collection itself. We need to know that when we have very large collections, we can expect that the public does not always know the 1,000, 1,500 artworks. We can attract the attention of the press, the attention of elected officials, and this is one of the drivers for acquisition. We always talk about money for acquisitions, but as you all know, acquisitions are often through purchase, and we'll come back to the different methods of acquisition that differentiates France from other countries in the world. We can purchase art at very interesting prices, gifts, participatory collections as well. There are so many different methods of acquisition. We always think that an acquisition is going to be at several million euros, but in reality, if we follow the market for historic reasons as well, in order to identify artworks that could be interesting for our collections, we can always find artworks that do not cost millions. Through tools by the state, for instance, allow us to identify bargains at very reasonable prices, and companies are able to purchase this. The arrival of a work in a collection is like the arrival of a child in a family. Everybody is happy, the teams are working together, the elected officials are happy, the public comes back, the press talks about it. And I think that is how museums are going to continue to be happy, bringing in a larger and larger audience. We've seen this since the end of the pandemic. The public is coming back massively to museums and want to see new art work or new works. So sometimes they're in our stock rooms, sometimes they've been acquired because our storerooms are a place of conservation from which we can take works. I do believe that we need reserves, we need storerooms, and we should and we need to know that the public is asking currently that asking that these works might be shown to the public rather than left in these storerooms. There are regular rotations, there are loans, and there's a whole ecosystem around acquisition that is not limited to a financial transaction between a curator, a museum, and a local authority and a merchant. Behind this, there's a rationale. It's the history of museums that is being created through each acquisition.
Thank you very much, Olivia. Leen, you come not from the finite sector, but more from the anthropology and history sector. How do you see the fundamental reasons that have led to a museum, or for which a museum would continue to acquire? The main difference, I think, is actually that I don't work in France. And I'm going to talk a little bit ICOM COMCOL, because this committee was founded in 2010, and it's the committee for dialogue around collecting, because this was not something that existed. It's a committee for focused on all the practices around collecting. And it was founded with a real desire to collect. So I don't share a lot with Olivia, but there is a real desire and a real interest for active collection that is really linked into society. And I think this desire for collecting in an active way starts, first of all, within a COMCOL. There's a really strong activity and a lot of discussion around the collection of current heritage. Who's collecting our digital heritage? Who's collecting changes linked into COVID and linked into climate change, which who is collecting issues, things and objects around our contemporary life? And then heritage is fairly poorly represented for some particular areas over the last few decades, with some improvement, but before that there wasn't really around migration, queer issues, women. We need to expand and strengthen our diversity and the polyphony of heritage. That's a really very important thing for COMCOL, and I think for a lot of museums. Actually, it's an important activity for COMCOL. And the third thing that is really at the heart of COMCOL is that we want to act as curators in much more participatory way through co-creation projects with social groups that have been little represented in collections up until this point. These are the three main focuses of COMCOL. And I think that museum serves society. This was in the previous definition of museums. It's of course in the new definition. This idea that museums are there to serve society. It's really interesting. I think that for COMCOL, the committee is really looking to see how to formulate and think about and imagine this role as a museum for society, connected with society, not only in the educational program and the events program, but also in the collection. And how can we develop new ways in order to connect into contemporary society. And it's about looking for new methods for collection that's very visible in historical museums, but is also very present in art museums. Recently, the Amsterdam Art Museum published a film called White Balls on Walls. The title is quite provocative, but it's about the unilateral perspective of curators, previous curators in that museum, and all of the challenges that are presented in the past. So the idea is really to expand collections and to bring them up to date. Of course, that's why collecting is really important. At the same time, research in French language, which is not really present in my Dutch mother tongue, and I think it's true also in English. There's not a lot of thinking around this specific word, acquire and acquiring. But I think that your research and this looking for a word that covers everything, I think this is because, in part, over recent years, the management of collections has become much more important than ownership. And so now, as curators, and museums, we're judged on the way in which we manage collections, much more than having them. And of course, all of the questions linked into origin of heritage, collecting within the context of colonization or during the Second World War by, for example, the Nazis who stole collections or illicit traffic. Today, there's this whole question of origin of collections at this point and of management. We need to do research on these questions. We really need to be very transparent about these issues. Everything, all objects linked to intangible heritage. How should we manage this? How can we take care of our collections? Is acquiring them and putting them into storage, is that protecting an object? Does that still make it possible to communicate a tradition? This is also a question that Marcus Waltz mentioned already, with this focus on the connection between objects and intangible heritage. The idea of acquiring objects has become a bit more problematic because I'm currently working on a collection of theatre puppets, and I think it might actually be better to make this tradition live by organizing very specific shows with theatre troupes rather than protecting the objects through acquisition in a permanent way in a storage center. And the third thing is that I think the issue of shared management or shared stewardship would be very interesting for the following discussion, because this is a way in which a number of museums in the US and in Canada have sought to take care of indigenous heritage during the period of colonization, which was sometimes very violent. And so, for example, these things have become collections within the Smithsonian Museum, for example, and there's a whole policy of shared stewardship where there's a change of ownership but the collection stays within the museum. So this is another idea in terms of acquisition. It's not no longer about acquiring and becoming an owner, but it's being as a curator the manager or the steward of the exhibition. So having a responsibility for taking care of collections, I think that's become more important, more significant than the fact of acquiring and acquisition. So I think a lot of museums are trying to refresh their collection practices, and I would really encourage everyone to become a member of ICOM COMCOL to talk about this together and think about this. But that's what I really wanted to share with you now. Thank you very much. So over to the audience and to the other speakers, if they want to respond to perhaps what Olivia has said or Leen has said, or whatever response you might have at this point. I'd like to add something here that with acquisition, there's an essential aspect. You don't acquire without really thinking a lot. It's the object or the piece that really becomes essential, and the way in which it's done is organized. So first of all, it's the object that becomes very clear, and then we think about how to do it. So we don't just acquire something for fun and then stick it in the reserves, because then it wouldn't really be presented. Acquisition is also a way of safeguarding objects. You can see behind me a painting, a very important painting, which throughout the 19th and 20th century was at the Château d'Antwerp. It's a really very important work by Léon Cognier with really a very important framework, but it would have been in a very precarious situation. It was in a very precarious situation. It was really damaged, and it wouldn't have been able to continue. And if we hadn't purchased it, if we hadn't acquired it, it wouldn't now exist. And so we really think through what we're acquiring, and we share this with the public, and we think about whether the object should be shared and whether it merits being shared. And the safeguarding of works through acquisition is something very important. I give you a whole number of different examples. I've had an example with other groups that have been acquired. These are works that are part of the history of art that through museums become much broader and connect into the history of art, not just as it has been told, but as it actually exists, as it actually is. So the museums have this role where this history of art is communicated with all its plurality, with all its social questions, with all these different aspects. Before handing over to Jade Garcin, who's raised her hand, I just wanted to respond to what Olivia has just said, and just to ask you, Leen, the example that you gave of the puppets is also quite paradoxical, because I understand, of course, the importance of making sure that this heritage persists, particularly when this is at the center of a living heritage like the theatrical arts, but at the same time, not acquiring this type of object, since we know they're so very fragile, and there is this really very temporary aspect because it's linked to a vernacular culture. So that means if we don't acquire them, they're going to disappear, and they're going to have a very, very quickly not be transmitted and communicated, handed on to the next generation. How do you bring together this desire for sharing and passing things on to the next generation without acquiring? The ideal is to be able to do both, of course. And I think that's what we should do. currently, where I'm working on this collection with the mass, that we're hesitating quite a lot. We've got hundreds of puppets for this kind of theatre, and there's a very great hesitation. We're thinking about reintroducing some of these puppets into society, and it's an internal debate that we currently have, because I think the idea of safeguarding objects is often limited to keeping them in reserves, but for some types of objects, that's not actually the ideal way of safeguarding them. It might be a good idea to keep a few, and so that we have objects that are really kept and that we take real care of, but they might, if we allow them to be reused or perhaps even changed because of changes in the tradition, they might be slightly damaged. And I think as a curator and all people linked into museums and collections and conservation, I think having a number of different ways of thinking about what we mean by safeguarding. Sometimes, like Olivia said, it's important to keep a very fragile work of art in reserves, but that's not necessarily the case for all objects that we want to collect. Sometimes we need a diverse approach, and that's why I think it's very important that we think about management and stewardship. Acquiring on its own is not enough. Thank you very much. So Jade Garcin and then Shidia. Yes, good evening. I'm sorry, I'm not going to turn on my camera because it's a bit complicated. I actually didn't think we were going to focus in on acquire, but perhaps I could just acquisition in this way, but I could perhaps just respond to this example, since I've worked on an exhibition of puppets as an example of how we can use them. I've been working in a marionette museum in the Garcin, and as a living art. And this is, yes, perhaps an intangible heritage, but within the context of this practice of acquisition, we chose to develop a system where we hadn't fully decided on the name yet, but we had an exhibition with a partly historical aspect and another aspect that was linked into the use of puppets and the current life of puppets. And we even worked with puppeteers and actors who wanted the puppets not to be acquired by museums, but to be destroyed. And I think that's why there's a very multiple responses to this, and this debate is very different depending on the type of museum. Because with different types of works of art, such as painting and sculptures, we want to keep them and hand them on to the next generation. But in some areas, such as puppets, for example, there is this question that is raised, is whether passing on this heritage, is that the role of museums? Because puppeteers can pass this tradition on to following generations. And this example of a particular work that people asked us to destroy raises this question. I don't know that I have the answer, but a lot depends on the type of museum.
Thank you very much for sharing your example. I'd like now to hand over to Julia. I would like to come back to what we've been talking about. And I think there's a double focus. First of all, we're not talking about acquisition here, we're talking more about collecting, but also shared management for puppets, for instance. And it is true that we will not have the same behavior depending on the collection. So I have always worked in an archaeological museum. Archaeological collections are not necessarily things that I have collected. There has been a flow of them into our museum. Firstly, our role is to conserve them, to study them, and to make them available to the public and to society. For puppets, for instance, this is another type of object. Like I said earlier, there are different modes of acquisition. These puppets will be placed in a museum and conserved. They will be managed by people who are professionals and also by the museum. But in my opinion, this term of acquiring or acquisition cannot be fully replaced with collecting. A few years ago, I was working with ICOM on terminology that we need to use in our inventories. And with mode of acquisition, we looked at this as well. And then we had this IT inventory with an exhibition focused on the objects that had been entered into this inventory, so that we could take all of the different objects that have entered into our museum in order to create our exhibition. If we want to use this for each type of internal mode of acquisition, there's a lot of studies that we need to do into the history of acquisitions in museums. Without doing this, we won't be able to go into the detail of the breakdown of acquisitions for an object. As we heard earlier from Olivia Voisin, there are different types of museums, there are different types of modes of acquisition. Collecting does not mean that there's going to be shared management. It could be in an ethnographical museum, in an archaeological museum, in all kinds of museums. And this is what I wanted to say about acquisition. Thank you very much. I saw that Olivia Borata, you had raised your hand to ask a question or perhaps share your experience. Yes, good evening. Thank you very much. I just wanted to respond to what we were just saying about the importance of scientific and cultural projects with the new focuses. That's what Olivia Voisin was talking about when we were talking about promoting women or certain communities within a collection. And to go back now to what Leen was saying, it's not just about acquiring or collecting, it's about what we're going to be doing around this. This project of acquisition needs to be part of a larger project. Thank you very much. Are there any other questions? If not, I propose that we move on to our second topic. Before this, I would like to share some reactions from the chat. This is an Italian colleague, Adela Maresca, saying that there is the existence at the International Museum of Marionettes, Antonio Pascalino di Palermo, a double action of safeguarding, but also to continue the profession of puppeteers and oral tradition through international festivals and performances. The second theme of our evening is about procedures and the ways and methods, processes of acquisition. Who among us hasn't turned down a pressing acquisition proposal, whether expenses or free of charge, from a particular artist or donor, elected representative, influential figure or community, patron, member of a society of friends of the museum, etc., arguing that any museum acquisition, far from being, as Olivia said, the result of a whim or an impulsive act, is governed by rules that apply at every stage of a long and perhaps too long, this is a question that we could ask, and rigorous chain of investigation involving many players. Marie-Christine Labourdette and Antoine Giquello, each in their own field. Could you please go back over the procedures that more specifically in France, but of course, we will be able to extend this with our listeners to Europe and the entire world, ensure a reasoned, secure and uniform policy for a single territory, for the acquisition and circulation of goods throughout the territory. What developments do you think are desirable in terms of acquisition procedures? Let's hand over to Marie-Christine Labourdette to start. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for allowing me to take part in this very exciting debate. I think that in response to this important question that Ariane has asked, let me begin by reminding you of the principles in place for acquisition by museums in France. These are shared by museums in France, whether national or regional museums. There are significant formalities regarding protections in place for all individuals responsible for the entire acquisition cycle. And there's also a principle of collegiality. This means that no acquisitions within a system under normal operation can be carried out by a single individual. Yes, somebody will sign the act of entering this into a public collection, but this is governed by the opinions of a number of different commissions, acquisition commissions and committees. For national museums, there are 3 different duties and 3 different levels of acquisition. This is important for, as we've heard, acquisitions are important in the life of a museum. And this is raising major questions due to a number of issues. I submitted a report to the ministers. We were questioning the robust nature of the acquisition chain, strength of this chain. The acquisition chain of a museum makes the museum the last link in a very long chain. involving a large number of players in reality. And I think that Alexandre Giquello will come back to this later, because the art market, as you know, goes to the very start of the chain with the artists, and then it can be very onerous to get right down to the museum. So as we're the last link in a very complex chain, we need to be working with people with excellent training, with excellent knowledge of acquisition procedures, along with knowledge of the risks as well inherent to how the art market functions. And also authenticity is also a significant issue. Training needs to be provided for all people working in and around these procedures, but also for museum curators. I would like to say hello to Personnaz, because I know that this is a very serious issue at the French Heritage Institute for continuing training. Skills around acquisition also need a specifically identified process in each museum. Very often, this is somebody's responsibility, and we need it. It's often a director of a museum, for instance, at a regional level, but a number of different skills are required, whether legal skills, financial skills, and it's important that we remember that. Formalizing procedures is essential in order to secure acquisitions, and formalizing procedures has been improved significantly in recent years and decades. But nevertheless, we need great vigilance, particularly for acquisition cases themselves. It is important that acquisition cases are well documented in order to protect the individuals looking to acquire and want to check that a minimum list of information has been collected. We also need to verify if all information available on the art market, the people that might be the best contacts for this acquisition were involved, and that due and reasonable diligence was conducted. This diligence also needs to be in place with the possibility of consultation of databases to make sure that this has not been stolen. This is not a part of a list at Interpol, for instance. In order to bring all of this information together, formalized procedures also adds clarity into the way that different acquisition committees work together to ensure that there is no conflict of interest and to protect individuals working collegiately on these acquisitions at various levels. It's also a way of verifying, this is the fourth point that's very important, that in the event of doubt about an artwork, whether it is entered into collections or not, that this doubt be raised correctly. That the date or worry can be raised across the entire chain of the museum involved, and to make sure that this is processed correctly in order to check that the museum acquisition committees have the correct information. This allows us to know what our next steps should be. All of these aspects are very important and falls under a museum's internal operations. I agree with what has been said so far. Regardless of the method or the mode of acquisition of the museum for a work of art entered into its collections, the risk and the serious nature of all the procedures to be carried out is the same, whether it is a free or paid acquisition, because there's a reputational risk for the museum. The museums do not want an object to enter its collection, even if it is free, if it has been stolen, if it has been looted, for instance. The negative impact that this acquisition could have would be less if it is not purchased financially, but we should not be treating procedures for verification and controls for works entering collections free of charge compared to those that are paid. I think this is a very important thing that we should not forget. And work on provenance, in reality, is part of an extension, in my opinion, on work on art history. The provenance of a work can tell us a lot about its history. The way that collections are formed, the collection methods, a lot of things about the life of our society. It's very enriching. It's not just about securing the work itself, but it teaches us a lot about its historical way of working. For these objects that tell the story of past, but are vigils of memory. And I think it is very important to take this research into provenance as very enriching scientific information. Moving on now to legal matters. With work on acquisitions and provenance, it is also important to realize, as we were saying, that museums are the last link in the chain. So we need to make sure that all of the work carried out in terms of procedural quality and probity of the art market has been conducted correctly. I'm sure that Alexandre Giquello will be talking more about this, as I know that he is very involved in this subject. So this is a fundamental matter in order to conserve the position and the place of France in the global art markets. With the UK leaving the EU, the EU is now the UK is the largest. France is now the largest art market left in the European Union, so we need vigilance, and we need to ensure that our controls are correct. Also, fight against the trafficking of cultural goods. This requires vigilance from all actors, from the Ministry of the Culture and all museum professionals. And also, of course, this is part of our sphere, whether it's Ministry of the Interior for monitoring illicit traffic, illegal trafficking. But there's also a matter of risks. Unfortunately, we can hear a secondary conversation. Please do turn off your microphone. Thank you.
So these aspects are really very essential, and fairly soon we're going to need to think and work on the question of import licenses within the European Union. This will require new organization for all countries receiving works from third countries of the European Union, in the sense that countries will have to guarantee the fact that the work or the cultural good that is entering the European Union and that will benefit from an import license, there will have to be a guarantee that it's been legally exported from the source country. So this will be a very complex and fairly significant administrative burden, which could lead to some concerns for museums and and some of them, the art market, which this could somewhat slow down the desire for acquisition. So I'll just perhaps conclude with some areas before the debate by just saying that in terms of acquisition procedures, all of the procedures and formal processes is a very important question for the French Ministry of Culture, and it's important to put this in place in order to make it possible for museum professionals to know how to deal with specific situations, and also to know that raising a doubt and a question about an acquisition should be seen as not as dramatic or as significant as it has been. What's concerning is not the fact of alerting a question or a doubt. What's a real problem is hiding any doubts. Dissimulation should be sanctioned, but alerting concerns and raising concerns should not be a problem. We might not know the whole of the story, the backstory of a work. There is no zero risk when we are acquiring goods, but it's important for the whole of the system and all of the procedures, the principle of collegiality, of commission, of working in a collective way on this aspect in order to bring the risk to a reasonable level that is the counterpart of the freedom that museums must be allowed to have in order to be able to continue to enrich their collections, to collect, to acquire, in order to be able to present works to the public for enjoyment, delectation, or for any other term that would be chosen by 75% of people working on these important subjects. So that's perhaps very brief, but that might allow us to launch debate somewhat. Thank you very much, Christine. Alexandre Giquello, over to you. First up, to you. Great, I've been able to put my microphone on. Thank you for inviting me to this really very interesting session. I do feel like I'm the disruptor here, but I'm okay with that. That's fine. Everything I've heard from the beginning is, do we need to burn museums? Well, I really don't think we should. I am totally opposed to that, but in terms of things that are more linked into our work on the art market, so perhaps I'll talk a lot more about public sales, but I will speak for all players on the art market. I've noted with all my colleagues and counterparts that there's a change of atmosphere, as it were. So to cite Jean-Luc Martinez, for a few years, the last few years, perhaps months, we've gone from a very different vision of the diligence required for the art market. And I've seen in terms of discussions that I'm having with the Musée de France in France or the Ministry of Culture, that today players in the art market and the world of conservation are together concerned with their own individual protection at a civil and criminal level, and there are some significant cases that are currently in progress. For the moment, the auctioneer has had a role of making sure that the transactions were secure for sellers and buyers. This was essentially focused on the authenticity of objects for many years. But now, in some areas, in some specialities, for example, archaeology, the main preoccupation now is origin or provenance. So now it's not about authenticity of objects, but also about provenance, origin. My first comment on that is that we need to understand that France is the only country in the world to have a law in this area, which around origin, where auctioneers in particular have an obligation of means, and that there is a significant reflection and that needs to be developed at this time at a legal and ethical level, because in frequent cases, this obligation of means becomes an obligation of result, and there is a significant difference here. And so if I pick up some things that I've heard during this debate, I've heard that one of the mottos of ICOM was to develop good practice, best practice, and I think that's the heart of what we're talking about today. We are in a phase where we are creating new procedures, best practice, and ways of doing things, a new kind of doctrine at a legal and moral, intellectual level on these issues around provenance, origin, and the protection of players in the art market and curators, because once again, we've been talking about the issue of bequest of items that have been bequested and had issues around their origin. But if there's an art market now that's really in doubt and questioning itself and actually is faced with a lot of bad press and actually is really suffering somewhat, the art market. Today, France is at a turning point because because Paris is becoming the European center of the art market, and there's a lot of work to do here on discussing and working together to create precise systems and concepts that are developed through dialogue, through discussion between players on the art market on the one hand, the administration on the other hand, and then Europe, of course, which is always nearby. And all of these procedures, all of these systems need to be developed together. I think it's really dangerous if we impose systems that are not accepted by both parties. Of course, the art market is going to need to have to do concessions, but it also needs to intellectually accept all these different systems. Otherwise, there will be consequences that will be very damaging for the development of in terms of the black market and parallel markets. That's something we need to be thinking about. Then there is a central question which I think we have the responsibility as art market players to take a position on this. And this is to do with the presumption of good faith of possessors, of owners of articles. who are selling their works. This is as of right at the moment, although we realize that it's somewhat being challenged at this point. The law has this obligations of means due diligence, which in the case of any doubt, the auctioneer may, etc., etc. So if, for example, the auctioneer has no doubt on the good faith of the person selling. So, for example, if people receive an inheritance and they don't know what is in their inheritance and they don't have all the documentation that should be with the different objects in order to prove the possession since 1997 or earlier, in an objective way with documentation. There are a lot of objects today that are still in France, in families, in collections, in inheritances that have no documentation at all. Just as an aside, just we should remind us that we had to wait till 2012 for the term of provenance or origin to be integrated into legislation. So that tells us a lot about the awareness of the importance of origin. 2012 is really quite recent in terms of the context. Before that, the legislation dated from 1981, and the term of provenance or origin as it's now understood wasn't mentioned at all. So there was negligence, and we need to recognize this over a number of years in terms of the analysis of the provenance and origin of works. But now we need to make sure that the pendulum doesn't swing too far in terms of Nazi spoils or theft. We have a fairly complete and comprehensive system that's easy to put into place in terms of our research and our preparation for sale. However, when I say it's fairly comprehensive, of course, everything's relative. We could talk about this perhaps more later. On the other hand, by nature, the objects from illegal traffic are not mentioned in any database, any categorization, and that means that there's a real problem, because here it's the auctioneer or the auctioneer's expert who's going to do all of the historical origin research, and it's them that are at the front line, and they are personally responsible. And here there is a real issue because they have a personal liability. We need to put in place a new doctrine, a new system, together with the private market and the public market. And I'll end there. Thank you very much, Mr. Giquello. So it's over to the audience now and to the other speakers if they'd like to respond to anything they've heard from Marie-Christine Nina Labourdette and Alexandre Giquello. If it's over to you, if you have something to say. Okay, since there are no questions yet, I will ask a question. Oh, there, Didier Riekner has one. Sorry, Didier, I'll just ask my question first, and then I'll hand over to you, Didier. So my question is primarily for Marie-Christine, and this is based on my very practical experience as a scientific manager of a museum. Very often I encountered difficulties around acquisition, inherent acquisition to the very sensitive area of the Museum of the Army, and you can imagine that, particularly in connection to our colonial history, where even when you've done all of the due diligence and I'd done everything that I was able to do, as you said, Marie-Christine, there is still a reasonable risk, and you talked about this. Or at least we need to seek to collegially develop a reasonable risk, but sometimes this reasonable risk cannot be heard by the committee. and the permanent delegation, which is often the case, which to which I submit my acquisition application. So my question is really very straightforward. Once we've done all due diligence, and that's something else, that something separate from research of origin and provenance, I think, which takes us into a history of collections, as Olivia said. But once all the due diligence that is available to be done has been done, and that there remains a reasonable risk, a risk that we can take liability for, would it not be worth, within the context of the committees and permanent delegations, would it not be better to approve the principle of acquisition, because at least we will have identified and brought into national collections objects that I can restitute if it is clearly demonstrated that my reasonable risk was unreasonable. It's a complicated question. There's two things going on here, because in terms of the principle of inalienability of collections means that integration into public collections has a very definitive nature, and it's very difficult to break away from that subsequently. So the impact of bringing an object out of national or public collections is always very complex to handle. So this could be a reasonable acquisition risk, but it might be an unreasonable risk for the reputation of the museum, or at least for the way it's handled subsequently. What's clear is that what you're underlining really very importantly, and what's essential, is that the quality of the acquisition application is really very important. This is something that's essential, which must really be looked into in detail so that we convince all of the different committees at the different levels working on the acquisition, in order to convince all parties that we can't do any more due diligence, and that the reasonable risk is covered, because reasonable risk is associated with life in itself. We can never have 100% certainty. There's no zero risk. But if we cannot convince everyone about an acquisition, there may be a question about whether it's actually important to bring this object into the collections, and then also the issue around the risk against the advantage, and here ratio, as it were. And here I share the opinion of Alexandre Giquello, where sometimes we have an obligation of result, where actually we should really be able to show that we've gone to the end of the process that is available. So research and goodwill, unfortunately, can't do everything, and at some point we encounter the fact that it's impossible to fully remove risk. So, but if we undermine the principle of inalienability and just bringing objects in, that might be quite risky. Yes, there will be framework laws that will make this possible, but they're going to be focused on three fairly limited areas linked to spoils, collections around Africa, and human remains as well, I think. So I think this is not to do with all of the spheres covered by acquisition in national and territorial museums within France. Thank God. There is a real variety of collections in French museums, which makes this possibility of collection, which is so exciting and really very essential for enriching the scientific impact of our museums.
Thank you, Marie-Christine. Didier and then Olivia. I'd love to give an example before Didier speaks, actually. It's to add to what we were saying about spoiled or looted works that may end up in a museum. And then they are sometimes there's a restitution. There's also a disappearance of works from museums. Sometimes we need time to carry out studies so that everybody can be convinced. But for example, in 1910, a work of art disappeared in Lyon, which is acquired by the Museum of Beauvais in 1994. Several decades were required to establish enough proof. It was acquired by the Museum Beauvais, and that was a good thing because it meant that it at least remained in a museum, but it's now going to be restituted to the Museum of Orleans. And this was a work of art that was stolen and has been restituted. It has bought and perhaps in other countries, then it's exhibited in other galleries, and this restitution would not have been possible if it had left France. So this can be useful to collections. It gives us the time to work by doing these studies in order to give a work of art another future, perhaps not within the collection it was in. I'd like to say two things about this. First, the prescriptability of museum collections should have incited the Museum of Beauvais to look at what was happening. Here you can see the usefulness of studies before and after acquiring works of art on the basis of lists to check that works are not missing from collections as well. Some periods were more difficult than others to manage. In the US a few years ago, we managed to recover a work of art that had been stolen by a German soldier during the First World War, and it ended up in the United States. And when it went onto the market, we were able to identify this and obtain its return. I think it was Le Havre. I think it was a museum in northern France, however. These things do happen. And it is clear that this work that we've been talking about on the history of art and its provenance before acquisitions or after its entry into the collections, when we're working on their history, this is essential because sometimes we can overlook aspects. There was a museum in Toulouse with a work of art that left the museum after the French Revolution and went to Italy, as it was marketed at one point, and we were able to recover it. We all have stories that show how this information is vital. And Olivia, as you were saying, it is really essential to work with colleagues and in greater depth. This means that we need to keep looking. What's reassuring is that the museum, two different museums wanted to purchase this work of art one after the other. This shows the quality of the work of art, and it's really deserved its place within public collections. Didier? Yes, I would like to come back to what you were saying, Ariane and Olivia. And what Alexandre Giquello was saying as well, is saying that we're on a weighing scales. I talk a lot with people working in art markets. There's a real deviation at the moment. A large number of works do not have any provenance. That wasn't the purpose a few years ago. And because a work of art isn't born with a little chart or a little chip to help us follow it from its creation onwards, what's the problem then? It's about archaeology, perhaps. The problem of artwork stolen by the Nazis, and also what you just said, the risk, what is it? The risk is that a work of art is spoils or stolen. The risk is quite low, providing that there's proof. So there's a very small risk after normal due diligence. There's a very small risk that a work of art had been stolen. I would prefer for it to be in a French public museum rather than with a private French or American or Chinese collector. I think sometimes we wash our hands of this. I would prefer us to purchase this work of art. The risk is quite low, let's be clear. If museum curators do their work, this is a risk that we need to run because we can restitute the artwork if needed. If we see that it's been acquired illegally very recently, we can restitute it. So there's a real deviation at the moment, a real interest in provenance. And I think it's really counterproductive for museums and for collectioners and even for the people who have had their artwork stolen as well. Is there a reaction or any comments, questions? If that is not the case, I am charged with timekeeping by INP and ICOM. I would suggest that we start with our third theme. We have already started to discuss this in detail. This is about the precautions and diligence required. Both of you have talked about recent events linked to forgeries, entering into collections, trafficking of archaeological remains, the looting of heritage from countries at war, cultural property that was looted between 1933 and 1945, or ill-gotten gains, spoiled art, particularly in a colonial context. And this makes it even more important to be able to trace the life of an object. So my question is very quick. So Marie-Christine Labourdette and Alexandre Giquello, how can we restore confidence to the different players and professionals involved in order to avoid us getting a form of precautionary approach that would prevent us from acquiring where we're choosing not to acquire? Can I start? Yes, Alexandre Giquello. Yes, you're talking about a kind of should I do this approach? This isn't vigilance. If we're going right to the end of this process, a worst case scenario process, this would be that we do nothing at all. This would be difficult for museums. There would be no more acquisitions. And we saw this is the life of a museum. This is its evolution for the art market. I've already talked about this. It would result in a black market where there is no control at all if this were to happen. So there are choices that we need to make. As ever, this choice needs to be made through dialogue, balance, and not a fatalist approach or an excessive approach. This balance needs to be accepted and then set in stone. And then we need to stick to it. Due diligence in terms of provenance needs to be redefined together, no doubt, in order to refine certain things. Once this has been acquired, we need to stick to it. And we should not change a legal issues here. The obligation for results on provenance means excluding part of the market from the art market where it is legal. For years and years, for centuries, objects have been exchanged under conditions that were not determined, so illicit. Countries often claim archaeological pieces, for instance, that were exported for years. There is the 1970 convention, which looked to determine the right rules, I believe. It's quite surprising to see that in 1970, we'd already said everything that needed to be said. So the rules that need to be applied for illicit markets, we need to stick to this. We cannot go beyond the legal framework under the pretext of arguments that become moral. We can't do anything in that case. Let's shut up shop. There's no market left. There's no acquisitions for museums. And in my opinion, this would be dangerous. Marie-Christine Labourdette, would you like to respond to this? I also believe that it is important to be realistic when taking into account realities on an art market. We can't hear you very well, Marie. Is that better? Yes, that's better. Thank you. Sorry, let me start again. I was saying that I agree with Alexandre Giquello that it is important to secure the art market, but that this security needs the full participation of all stakeholders in a contractual manner for a sharing of responsibilities in order to retain confidence in the French market. This is not a policy of the stick by the authorities. It's about all stakeholders in the art market becoming aware of the importance for due diligence actions that are operational with the results, because it is difficult to be certain of what we're saying, so we don't want an obligation of results. But there should be a commitment from all art market professionals in this area. That is essential. We know that the auctioneers have a very clear role with the work with the sales houses, supports this guarantee of probity and morality. There are questions raised around experts. This is an extremely important profession on the art market. It is not a surprise to say that this is not a regulated profession. And there are questions about the way that it is self-regulating. This may lead to a shared ethics charter between experts and auctioneers. This could help everybody to feel that there is confidence and trust in the art market. But we're talking about things, it's like trains that are late rather than trains arriving on time. This coordination and better relationship between the public authorities These are often coercitive powers, not from the Ministry of Culture, but from the Ministry of Interior or the Ministry of Justice, Ministry of Finance, looking at major financial transactions on the art market. This would deserve being reviewed with the consultation of professionals for museums as well. Having expertise capacity within the Department of Architecture and Heritage would allow museums doing their best to receive support from experts. Beyond this desire to acquire, it will help them to ensure that everything has been checked with correct databases, all due diligence possible. This would help guarantee reasonable risk has been taken into account around this acquisition with circumstantial evidence, so that they can continue to move forward with this desire to acquire and protect essential works. So it's about working together, taking things into account. I think it's important we've changed air a little bit with the new awareness now. The history of a work is not just based on its authenticity, but also its provenance. I agree with the fact that not everything will be known or written down, but it is important that everything that we can find during a limited time period, obviously, because between the moment that we want to acquire and the moment that we acquire, there's not always a lot of time. But research needs to be carried out with a maximum level of professionalism and efficiency on the part of all stakeholders involved in these acquisitions. I think that this is a period where we're learning, we're adjusting, there will be changes, and we'll be improving training for curators, for auctioneers. There will be dialogue and discussions that need to be taking place. But we need the art market to remain dynamic and to inspire confidence. And for that, we all need to be working towards it. Are there any reactions? Anything that anyone would like to say? Do you have any questions? I propose in that case to move on to our fourth team. Marie-Christine Labourdette has given me a perch here talking about training and skills that need to be developed in terms of research into provenance and origins. The tradition of both the connoisseurship and the history of collections goes back a long way and remains a cornerstone of research into museum heritage. Transdisciplinarity has also become a widely shared approach, while the diversity of origins, backgrounds, and professional interests, which is reflected in the graduating classes of the INP in France, has increased, particularly among curators. But is this enough? Olivia, Voisin, Leen Beyers, in your opinion, what are the main human levers on both an individual and collective level are needed rather than procedural ones, and this in order to consolidate the scientific manager's means of action within a museum as part of its collecting and acquisition policy? Olivia, over to you.
Sur quelque chose
I'd like to respond to something that Marie-Christine Labourdette said, which is really very true, is that we're often separated out from the research between the moment it's identified, an object is identified, and the moment we want to acquire it. If the work has already been done by a gallery, there are issues there. Of course, if we do an auction, there's a chance of much more competitive approach. But curators aren't the only people that are tracking the market. Of course, there's the private market as well, and galleries can acquire much more easily than private members. And the research carried out, one of the issues around acquisition today is not only provenance, but also price. And if we go through the acquisition committee and there's risk of paying for work too much, and between the moment when we select a piece and when at the moment it's in a catalogue in a gallery, there's a whole process there, but there is a real cost associated with works. I think there are three essential points when we want to acquire an object. First of all, there's this research, whether we have the time or not to carry it out, but also we need to see the object, and seeing the object requires knowledge and connoisseurship, which needs to be developed among the younger generation. Having objects in your hand and understanding whether the piece that has been photographed in the catalogue, whether it really is the right object. We've got so many stories, all of us, of having gone to see an object and to discover that actually the object is not in a good enough state to be able to be included in our collections. And then this is really essential for understanding the object and evaluating it, and ensuring that it is worthy of entering the collections of the Musée de France collections, French museums. And this, the big department identifies issues at this point and helps museums on acquisitions proposed. And as we've heard from Marie-Christine Labourdette, there will be new missions given to departments of French museums to contribute to the research, who have real difficulties with the short deadlines, not in order to prevent galleries taking over acquisitions, but of course, coming together and working together, it will give us strength. And if we work together, we will be able to respond to these requirements that require a lot of time. And we also need to think through the role of different entities and think about this collegial approach. Think of the inspection when directors of French museums went into the museums regularly, had a detailed knowledge of the museums and could identify different works and think of such and such a museum. That's something that's perhaps we're losing these days. Think of national treasures who might think of particular museums. I've got an example in mind of a work that ended up going to China, but that could have been prevented, perhaps. But our collegial approach is being developed differently through a network of specialists working together, bringing together museums. We are in a museum in Orléans that makes a lot of acquisitions. People ask us about our work on provenance, about our methodologies for developing opinions on objects, and also more generally, networks of specialists are being developed in parallel to the work carried out by the departments of the Musée de France, French museums. And this is something that could almost be officialized, groups that are identified of specialists in different museums. So perhaps curators who've been through the same competitive exam as for national exams. So since 1992, we'll all go through the same exams, and the specialities are spread across France. And so there's in the Museum of Orléans, we have one of the rare specialists in the Fonda who's always asked when people are wanting to acquire a work linked into his speciality. So this is something we could develop in addition to the service of the Musée de France with research around provenance. There's perhaps something that we could do in this area, and Musée de France could perhaps develop a service that could help with that. Perhaps this is something that could be added into the Grand Département service, which is available. And the fact of working in a network would make it possible to send colleagues to go and see a work. When you're in Orléans, it's easy to go to Paris. It's just an hour away. But if we want to go further afield, it's more complicated. And it's good to have contact people on site who can go and see an object, and we can really have confidence in this person, knowing that the person has a reliable judgment on the condition of the object, of the authenticity of the object, and all these things we're talking about. So all of this isn't very simple necessarily to put together, but it's this work in a central administration and within museums with scientific players that we may be able to put in place a system that will make it possible to be much more responsive. And I saw Claire that responded. I haven't seen what she's written, but she's on the front line in terms of understanding the responsiveness required of museums. We have a lot of, she faces a lot of requests that she responds to very quickly. It's very important to very quickly send applications. The most joyful moment of the acquisition is when the work is presented within the museum, but there's a whole reality behind that. There's a real administrative burden of work to carry out that's associated with this immense joy of acquisition. And there's a lot of people mobilized and working together in team, and acquisition is always teamwork, and it's something that perhaps should be thought through again and reconsider the missions of this work. So Claire, I will just read what you said. The SMF, so the Museums of France can do a lot of things, but only with if it has adequate resources. So we've talked about collegiality in a professional perspective. That's what Olivia has talked about. But Leen, perhaps you'd like to talk about another type of collegiality involving the participation of other players, perhaps. Yes, I think that current curators need to be networkers. They need to develop networks with collectors, with the art market, and with social groups that are connected into collections that they're working on. In our museum, we have art and history works from across the 5 continents. It's a very diverse collection. It's local, global, and worldwide in terms of our reach, and the roles of each of the curators are linked to research and knowledge of the area of art or the history of which the collection, for which the curator is responsible. But it's also about provenance research and also creating networks with collectors, art market, scientific world, and also with social groups, which is really important for this type of collection. So, for example, we have a collection of art from Africa, which is really very significant, and we need not only to have networks with collectors who are important for this type of object, and they have an important knowledge associated with this type of object, but also with partners from the country of origin and from the diaspora, the people coming from a particular country, like, for example, the Congo. So it's really important to create dialogue with them and to create a whole network around this collection as curators. So I think at the same time, there's scientific work that needs to be done and also diplomatic work that needs to be done. It really is diplomatic. I think that's the kind of work that we need to do at this point, and it requires a lot of work, and you can easily underestimate the amount of work that's required, the diplomatic work that's required. And I'd also just like to come back to this question of acquiring objects with uncertain provenance. I think it's a good idea, at least for museums. I'm sure it's different for people involved in the art market. I think it would be a good idea for museums, very important for museums, to think about the type of collection they want to develop, what they want to acquire in the future. Do museums in Europe, does it make sense for museums in Europe to still continue to collect works of art from countries in Africa, for example, works of art from the colonial period? Is that something that should continue? In our museum, in the Mass, we think that it's important today to collect objects that come when it's about collecting objects from these other countries. We need to focus on art, on contemporary art from up to date today's objects, and to strengthen our collections, enrich our collections, which have been which were generally collected at the colonial period. You can still find objects on the art market that that are very similar to what we have in our collections, but we need to change our theme, change topic, because now we live in a different day. We are now, I hope, in a post-colonial period in museums, and I think we need to change the type of object that we collect. Are there any questions or responses from anyone at this point? So I've got two things to say at this point, so I'll make the most of that, just to get the debate going here, just to get that flow of questions going. This is a question that I would ask openly to the whole community. Olivia and Leen have talked about the importance of expertise, the expertise of curators, who need to have this practice associated with research, and they need to be true scientists who can act for the purposes of acquisition. Should we not end up with a prohibition for curators that would prevent curators from being experts? A lot of us, and this is one of the reasons why big departments exist these days, but this is true in a whole number of territorial museums around France, as Olivia has reminded us. A lot of us are the specialists, sometimes the only specialists in specific areas. So I think, for example, of very specific areas. So thinking of the museum that I'm responsible for, working with colleagues who are probably the most developed specialists in the area of expert assessment of particular types of weapons at a national level. Whereas today, professional ethics of curators of national heritage forbids us from presenting ourselves as experts and giving experts assessments when the close relationships between curators, people in the market, experts, and the art market are all very important, and these connections need to be consolidated so that there can be permanent dialogue. And many of us have learnt a lot by going to sales, getting into contact with auctioneers, people involved in negotiating sales, and experts. So this is a question I'm asking. Of course, it's not about curators receiving retribution for the expertise that they present, but simply we should recognize that they have genuine expertise which territorial communities and the whole museum network, particularly in France, calls on these, particularly within big departments and within acquisition committees. So there's a kind of a paradox here where we're defending the expertise of curators, but we don't recognize it as such under the professional ethics code. That's an issue. Marie-Christine, perhaps you'd like to respond. Yes, I think the question of the expertise of curators or the big departments is a real question, but I think we can deal with this question I think it's covered by the professional ethics code for two reasons. First of all, because it can be used to bring objects into the national collections that are on the market. So it's up to the best experts to determine what a piece is. So if there's expertise among the curators or the major departments, and I agree with Ariane and Olivia here in terms of the expertise of these major departments. It covers the whole of the scientific college of all curators within France, since particularly now we're working in systems that makes it possible that we can work together. So the expertise exists, and museums have to work with curators. So then I guess I want to say may the best man win, but everything depends a little bit on how this actually functions. But I think in terms of the question of expertise of curators, if it should not be used for the markets, because actually you become personally liable, and then you take on the role or liability when a private collector is going to say, no, the curator of such and such a museum said such and such. And then if there's an issue of authenticity or provenance, that would create a real issue around legal liability. So I think that the current situation is not perfect. I think that connections exist across the different players of the art market, but it is a market that is nevertheless competitive, because when museums acquire, they don't always necessarily have a lot of money, and so they can't always identify an object, as Olivia said, on the art market before it heads into a gallery and it sees its price doubled because the work has been identified or expertly assessed by someone else outside of the museum. That is just part of the work of curators, in my opinion. And I think it means that enriching public collections is also about doing it not against other people, but doing it in competition with other people who want these Good. So I think it's important that experts, that people should keep their expertise, and the public expertise should remain within the public domain. Yes, but at the same time, Marie-Christine, we can see every day that curators, through their expertise, are cited through their reasoned catalogue. Yes, but the fruit of research is public. So that's totally legitimate, of course, and that doesn't, the expertise is publicly available. The expertise of curators is made use of course, but the liability of the curator within this reason catalogue is only for their catalogue. They are not responsible for the fact that this catalogue is used for identify or authenticate such and such a work by an auctioneer or by another expert. So I think the individual responsibility or liability of a curator or of a scientist is something that makes this very difficult or even very impossible. I think using curators as private experts on the art market is really something we can't do for this reason. That's only my position, and I am no longer a director in this issue. So now you should address the ministry around this question, if you wish. Are there any other questions or reactions, Olivia? If we talk about this question of expertise, there's a world between signing a certificate for an auctioneer and having just taken part in a scientific discussion, which of course will bring together people from different environments and backgrounds around an object. It's not only curators that are interested in objects. Often art market dealers are experts and auctioneers as well. And I think we all have a lot to gain from developing good relationships, not competitive relationships, but actually scientific collegial relationships, not only for research, but also for when objects are discovered. And when we get on well scientifically with the art market repays us well. A whole number of times we've had dealers who've let us have priority on different sales, and the prices have been able to be drastically lowered because we will always be we'll always have that gratitude and that recognition of dealers who leave space for us. Yes, I totally do agree with you there. I was just really talking about the fact that the positioning of a curator as an expert on the art market is something that could develop and create legal consequences, which would be very complex to handle subsequently. But of course, being in a dialogue, being in a discussion is something that is very clearly the role of discussion. That's something that's totally different. The positioning of a curator as an expert, an explicit expert for dealers, that would be an issue, I think. And I think for me, that would be impossible. I don't think that's possible. But of course, the fact of dialoguing and discussing, as you rightly say, through a cooperative relationship, we always learn things from our partners. We are saying very clearly that museums are at the end of a chain, as it were. If they're part of a chain, then if they're the end of a chain, then the whole chain needs to be preserved, and understanding that everyone has a specific role to play within that chain. Thank you very much. Would anybody like to speak and respond to any of this? Okay, well, thank you. In which case, I would like to invite Olivier Zeder to conclude at this point.
Olivier.
Olivier, your microphone was switched off. My apologies. Yes, thank you very much. This is not going to be a simple task, but I'm very satisfied because we have seen that we do still have the right to acquire under certain precautions, but we can do it. I don't know what you think of this, but some of you have said the opposite. There are professionals working in ethnographical museums for whom it's perhaps different. But let me go back over what has been said. We started by talking about terms, acquire and collect. Markus Waltz gave us a bit of a historical overview of the use of the term collection, acquire, and collect. Starting with the 1900s, and then this led to the latest 2022 museums definition by ICOM, where the term acquire and collect were both possible, but that the new 2022 definition by ICOM said nothing about acquiring intangible heritage. That the definition did not say whether yes or no we need to acquire in order to be a museum. Then Juliette Raoul-Duval took the floor to talk about what happened around discussions of the museum's definition within the ICOM working group. She recalled the methodological principle applied, paying close attention to the result. I've understood it this way, as asking whether the methodology allowed for different perspectives to be taken into account. Sometimes there were contradictions within the use of term. The term acquire was pushed to one side because for some people, it defined museums too much as a place where we collect, we acquire, collections expand. She said that it can be very clear that museums aren't necessarily places where collections are increased through acquisition. Acquire was limited, but the term enrich could be good, as it reminds us of the cabinets of curiosities. Acquisition is associated, not only associated with financial gain, sometimes it is free. There were modifications of terminology for the future that's possible, but that we're going to need to talk with ICOM at the right time about the use of the word acquire. 3 people really criticized the term collect, saying that it was no longer satisfactory because collect is just one mode of acquisition that fall under the umbrella of acquire with the archaeological and ethnographic acquisition methods, and that it was not adequate. Someone representing a group of people mentioned that the role of museums are not necessarily to acquire, but to look after existing collections and to study them and pass them on to future generations. Someone even asked whether we need to burn museums down. That's what we heard at the end. After this, after these definitions of terms, we went into the 4 major themes. The first was, why do we acquire? So Olivia Voisin was talking, saying that a museum that is not acquiring dies because acquisitions bring life to a museum. Acquisitions require us to work with participatory patrons. Acquisitions can be the result of individuals that want to receive gifts from their local community. Some of these gifts were the origins of the museum. Thousands of curators have been doing this for many years. Understanding provenance or origin is another reason for acquiring objects. It's a way of filling in the gaps in our collection, extending the art history, and supporting research within art history. She also said, and I think this is important, that the public is happy to see new acquisitions from a museum. Post-COVID, more numerous visitors have appreciated seeing new objects. Leen Beyers was our next speaker, giving a different perspective, talking about the association of a group in ICOM called COMCOL, which is a group that looks to define the role of society in collecting within museums. I'm reading my notes because a lot has been said. So she believes it's important to collect rather than to acquire, using the term collecting because it's in COMCOL. The essential is for us to collect in order to promote current heritage, promote contemporary objects in order to align ourselves with current society. This is one of the major issues at COMCOL. She also mentioned the concept of property. Why does a museum have to acquire? Why could it not borrow in order to exhibit, to create events? She talked about shared management with the indigenous peoples in the USA and Canada. For her, museums are made for society, and she's thinking about how this collecting can express something of what current society is, and new collecting methods as well, as I just said. Curators are no longer judged on their managing of collections, but on their acquiring of collections. There are a number of questions after this. Comments were made around the fact that acquiring is also a matter of safeguarding and sharing them with a much broader public. Ms. Beyers was talking about glass puppets, which are important in her museum, and asking how to showcase them without degrading them. Then there's the question of resale, so that they can be better used within the exhibition. We were talking about experiences around this living art of puppets or marionettes and the use of them in events so that the public can better understand what they are. An important remark by a number of people is that this discussion does not account for the diversity of collections and uses. The next theme was, how do we acquire? Marie-Christine Labourdette was talking about the report improving the security of acquisitions by a natural museum, questioning formalism that's been in place for a number of years, which protects acquisition managers, and the principle of collegiality as well. She focused on collegial processes and that acquisition matters need to be led by museum directors with collegial processes in place such as committees of acquisition. She discussed the issue of origin or provenance, which can be studied before or after acquisition. The importance is not just that doubt is in place for the purchase, but also research needs to be conducted after the acquisition. A number of processes have been implemented by institutions in order to protect the French art market, which is really essential. The ministry is going to produce guidelines for curators at the moment. There are perhaps some more worrying elements that have been changing over recent years and months, where the markets of institutions want to protect themselves with regards to poor acquisitions. From now on, we want to secure these objects. The issue for the public is provenance. That's become a major issue. So a continually doubtful market is going to struggle to operate. But it's important to have a major place in the global art market, as the United Kingdom is no longer a major competitor with France after Brexit. So we need methods within Europe in order to increase confidence to ensure that France can be a major player in the global art market. The risk, alternatively, is to develop that there would be the development of an illegal art market within France. He reminds us that there are a number of issues, and identifying owners is important, but there have been a number of years of negligence in research. There's a lot of questions raised around this issue.
We heard about acquisition at the Museum of the Army from Mrs. James Sarrazin, and about the fact that we cannot be certain about pure provenance. And this is actually what we're looking for when we think about provenance. And these are issues that come back in terms of acquisitions. And she was asking the question, and I think this is essential, whether the reasonable risk of avoiding error in an acquisition developed by a curator that comes to be, whether this could be taken into account by the acquisition committee, whether it's a central committee or a regional committee. And she was asking about whether it would be useful to take a risk in order to bring an object into collections, which would be then identified, exhibited, and catalogued more easily. Mrs. Labourdette was uncertain about these this sort of acquisition because of the inalienability of collections within the French museums as a principle that is difficult to undo. It's difficult from an administrative perspective, so there would be a rather difficult risk here. So she always comes back to the fact of the application for acquisition that must always show that we can't go any further in terms of our research. And then we heard from Mrs. Voisin about the fact that we need to find the origin, and there should be a really rigorous requirements linked to provenance. certain provenance is always very difficult. And this really rigorous requirements can be very negative for museums who are therefore not able to purchase, and because they can't get an object, a work that they consider not to be perfect. So the penultimate theme was around what precautions and diligence we should be acquiring. So here there was an importance of avoiding an excess of precautions. For Mrs. Labourdette, there needed to be a collective commitment of all professional players to take a responsibility for all the moral requirements. And she believes that experts who are not a regulated profession, they can sometimes be perhaps not responsible, but they can't always be considered as reliable reliable partners. And she also regrets the fact that things that sometimes we talk a lot about the problems, but actually often things go along without any errors. She really talks about the importance of training for all, not only of curators, but particularly people on the art market, and of the necessity of restoring confidence to have a dynamic art market. Alexandre Giquello came back to the considerations linked of and concerns about creating problems for different players in the markets, which would lead to an illicit and trade on the black market. And then there was an obligation of means, but this has become an obligation of results for all players on the market, which encourages the illicit market. The last theme was what skills and knowledge are required to acquire in order to better handle acquisition applications. Olivia Voisin talked about the very short lead times that we have, and in terms of acquisitions, and also sometimes the pressure to buy at lower prices. Galleries buy at higher prices, and this makes things complicated. So there's a kind of contradiction here in terms of the resources available and objectives. She talked about collegiality, and Mrs. Labourdette talked about this in terms of the roles we play in different committees, etc. But Olivia Voisin talked about additional resources being given to the major departments within French museums in order to support curators and develop increased collegiality, to formalize networks that already exist between curator colleagues in order to help people acquiring for institutions and in working on auctions as well. Leen Beyers talked about her policy of acquisition within her museum in Antwerp, and she creates connections between collectors, the market, social groups linked into the objects collected, and the partners from countries of origin, and she connects this work into a kind of diplomatic work that is required. She talked about uncertainties at the time of acquisition, and what she said was really connected into ethnographic objects, which make up a significant part of her collection, and for her museums now should no longer collect colonial objects, but really be focused on contemporary art. So there's been a change of epoch, a change of era, and so we need to collect contemporary objects. to end. A number of questions came up, and Mrs. Sarrazin raised a question about the expertise of curators and whether we should bring this to an end. Of course, she's not saying that there should be retribution or negative impacts for these experts, but experts should be able to work on the private market. She asked whether they should be able to work on the private market since they have a real expertise, and this would be very helpful for curators and also for the markets working on these objects. For Mrs. Labourdette, this would be a significant problem because curators would end up liable and would have legal liability when they give advice for a work bought by a private player. And she thinks that this is really something that cannot be taken into account, cannot be countenanced. But she thinks that there can be informal exchanges between curators and the market. So, of course, a catalogue can be used for an expert assessment, but it is also a public research project, and so it does not present the same legal liabilities for the author as an expert assessment might be. Olivia Voisin talked about the fact that we need not to confuse information given for an auction and the signing of a certificate for an auction and a simple discussion in a scientific context, and says that we need to avoid competition between all these different players, and we need to develop a connection of relationships of trust between all the different players. So this might be a little bit confused as a summary, but the discussion has really been very rich. Thank you, Olivier, for these concluding words that bring an end to our evening. It's already late, so I won't be very long. I just wanted to say thank you to all of the speakers. Thank you for taking the time to have speaking really without any taboos and really without any kind of avoiding difficult issues. Thank you very much, Ariane, for handling the time so well and just doing such a great job. Thank you for everyone who's taken part in the chat. I think this is a really very interesting topic, which is really at the heart of what all of us are doing, and it shows how much our professions are continually being developed, and this is an area that we're working on quite a lot. So just to give you a few dates for future upcoming dates, of course, there's the Sustainable Development Cycle, which I think you will be interested in. The next session is on the 5th of July. Then there will be the professional day, which will take place in Tours and on video conference. If you can't travel, there will be the theme around new uses and new models. And the next ethics debate evening will take place on the 13th of November, and it will be based on new digital tools. I hope that this evening will give you a thirst to be with us, and please do get in touch with us if you have any questions about anything, and a really good evening to all of you. Thank you very much.